my name is Ryan Freese, and I'm a technology consultant for Ingram Micro. Just want to start by welcoming everybody to the second segment of Take a Look. I'm here to talk to you about conditional-based two-factor authentication and how it can be done with Citrix's ADC's built-in functionality. Since you're watching this video, chances are you already know the importance of implementing two factors of authentication in any organization. Just looking at some of these major logos below, you'll see even the big companies out there have been breached due to a compromised password. Chances are you've heard stories of all of these big companies and the amount of customer records that were taken and put in on the dark web from each. So what I really want to do is I just want to jump into the user experience side of things first before we jump into how we can enable multi-factor authentication with using Citrix's ADC's built-in functionality, so you can see what that user experience would look like. Because after all, being able to balance the user experience with security is the main reason we're here today. So let me go ahead and I'm going to bring up my NetScaler Gateway page here. And this will look fairly familiar if you've ever logged into a Citrix environment remotely before. The only thing you'll notice that might be a little bit different is I have a little icon for a first factor. So let's take a use case here. Let's say in my case, I'm using Ryan's account. Let's say I'm an IT administrator for a financial firm. And a typical day to me is a little different than what a typical day of some users would be. I work from Panera, I work from Starbucks, I work from the park, I work from home, you name it. I work anywhere but the office. And I have a lot more access than what a typical user would have, whether that be to back-end systems, to various applications, you name it. And I also will admit that the password I'm using for this, I use for other applications as well. So chances are, if somebody gets a hold of my other passwords, this account can be easily compromised. So how do we prevent that? And what you'll see here is once I type in my username and password, it's going to take me to a second screen where it's asking me for a one-time password. So what I'm going to do here, I'm just going to type in the word push because I have an app on my phone for a secondary one-time password. And it's going to send me an approve message, and as soon as I hit that approve, you'll see it logged me in. And it logged me in because I entered that secondary authentication factor. So let's go back. Let's take another use case. So let's say Alcina here just joined this financial company, and she's a summer intern. So she only has access to maybe one or two applications or a very locked down desktop, so she can do some stuff from home, like maybe work on video content or something along those lines. So when she logs in, rather than it presenting her with that secondary authentication factor, we're not too concerned about her level. So we're just going to log her in right away. And that's really what we're going to be talking about in this video today, of how we can do that with some of the built-in functionalities of Citrix's ADC. So jumping over to the PowerPoint here, let's first talk about the requirements required to do this. So first of all, you need a Citrix ADC. That's the whole point of this discussion. But you also need advanced or premium edition licensing with your Citrix ADC. And the reason you need that is because we need access to a particular free feature called AAA for traffic management. You're also going to need some type of third-party authentication vendor in this scenario. So sure, you might have one in place today, but here's some of the ones I know of. So you have RSA, you have Duo, you have OneLogin. In the case of me, I'm using something called Digital Persona. You have Centrify, etc. So really any third-party authentication vendor that supports Radius authentication, you can use. So what is AAA? Let's talk about Citrix's AAA feature on their ADC. So really what AAA does is it allows any clients with proper credentials to connect securely to protected application servers from anywhere on the internet. This feature incorporates 3 main security features, as you can see here. You have authentication, authorization, and auditing. They're pretty self-explanatory, but for the sake of this video, I'm going to go into both, or to all 3 rather. So first we have authentication, and really this enables the ADC appliance to verify client credentials and allow only approved users to access that backend protected server or servers. You have authorization, and authorization will verify which content the user should have access to on that protected server. And then you have auditing, which is just going to keep a record of the user activities on that protected server. So this is really the backbone of what AAA is. So I could go into the whole workflow and how it works, but I'm not going to. Instead, I'm going to provide a link in the description box to where you can go to Citrix's website to find more information about how all of this works. So again, you can find that in the description box. But we are going to go into a little bit more of more about AAA and things like the supported features and terms to know. So as far as supported features, you have your basic authentication protocols that it supports. So you have LDAP, Radius. If you're looking at federated services, we have Auth as well as SAML that's supported. You also have certificate-based authentication, and you can have multiple authentication servers to support that 2 factors of authentication. And I love this little graphic here because best practices used to be complex passwords are the best practice, but that's not true. 2 factors of authentication absolutely is what best practice is. So terms to know. So I'm going to be mentioning these a lot within the next couple of slides, as well as when I do a quick demo of the management console of my ADC. But the first thing you want to know is, what is a logon schema or login schema? Really, a login schema is just the XML construct to provide information to the UI tier. So it's basically the form that the user is going to see. So when you saw earlier when I logged in with my username and password, that's a logon schema that provides that form. Also, you want to know what the authentication policy label is, and really all that is it's a collection of authentication policies for a particular factor. So basically, I'll show you during the demo, but a policy label can have multiple policies associated with it, as well as a logon schema to enable multi-factor of authentication. It'll make more sense once you see it. So here are some sample use cases as to why you might use AAA. There's probably so many more. If you have good suggestions, feel free to comment below. But I'm going to highlight a few of these here. So the first one here is what I demonstrated in today's video. So it's getting the username and password first, then requiring a second authentication factor based on group membership. So in this case, I'm looking for a group membership called Citrix 1FA, and if a user is a part of that, they only have to enter their username and password and nothing else. Otherwise, they have to enter a secondary factor of authentication, in my case, a one-time password. Here's another example here. So in this case, 2-factor authentication with one logon schema and one pass-through schema is configured here, where the client will first submit one username and 2 passwords. The first set of username and password is going to be authenticating via an LDAP policy as a first factor, and the second password, or one-time password you can set up here, is going to be evaluated through a radius policy. Jumping down a little bit, so this is actually a really cool one. So this is doing multi-factor authentication using certificates. So in this case, your first factor of authentication is a certificate, and the username is going to be extracted from that certificate and pre-fill the username field using that extraction on the logon form. And then you would have your password as your secondary factor. Going down, so in this case, you would have a username, password, and domain drop-down option, and a user would enter their credential and select their domain, and depending on which domain they select, the ADC will choose the appropriate LDAP policy for authentication. So just some example use cases here. Next slide here. So this is what we did in the demonstration. So for regular users, they're going to be required for 2 factors of authentication every time, but maybe we have some exempt users where we don't want to prompt them for a secondary authentication factor every single time. And in this case, if they're part of the Citrix 1FA group, they will be logged in immediately after they type in their username and password. So this is how my lab is set up, and I'll explain kind of how this works, and then we'll jump into the management side of things. But the way we start out here is we always start out with the gateway virtual server. So a user will first hit the NetScaler gateway page, which is actually configured with a AAA virtual server. And I'll show that again in the management side. So this AAA virtual server is what holds all of my other policies, logon schemas, actions, you name it. So the first thing that I have configured here is a logon schema called ls-pol user pass. Ignore the naming conventions for all of these. It doesn't really follow anything. I was just trying to get it to work. So this login schema here, this is what I'm using to display the user with the fields on that gateway page. So that's remember the logon schema is an XML construct to speak to the UI. So this is going to be the UI where a user will see their username and password field. There's also a policy assigned to the AAA V server, and in this case I called mine username pass, which has an action assigned to the policy called Auth AD for LDAP authentication. So when a user logs in first, they go to the gateway, which sends them to the AAA V server. They see the logon schema with the username and password field. They enter their username and password, and the Auth AD action will do the authentication via LDAP. That authentication policy has a go-to expression assigned to it called next. And what that's doing is it's going to proceed to a policy label called check groups. So after a user authenticates using their LDAP credentials, it's going to automatically go to this policy label here. This policy label is a little unique. It has no logon schema assigned to it. Instead, it has 2 policies assigned to it in a specific order to check the recently authenticated user's group membership. So if the user is a part of the Citrix 1FA group, authentication is complete and the user is logged in. However, if the user is not a part of that group, it proceeds to the next policy called radius non-manager, and that policy will send the user to another policy label called user radius non-manager, which sends the user to a policy called radius adv, again policy naming convention, ignore that, which has a logon schema assigned to it. So that's where you saw earlier where I just see a single field for my one-time password, and there's a profile assigned to that, not username pass, ignore that. It's called only radius token, which has an action assigned to it to do the radius authentication. So that's kind of how the workflow works. If you do have any questions, feel free to comment in the box below, but maybe once we jump into the management side of my NetScaler, it'll make more sense. All right, so let's refresh the page, make sure I didn't time out. There's a good chance I did. Yep, so I'll log in. Good practice, change that default NSRoot password. I think I did on mine. Of course, I saved it on my browser. But let's go ahead. If you've never configured AAA, it's going to be under security and then AAA application traffic. And first thing I want to show, actually, let's go into the gateway first. And just so you can see on my gateway here, I have the AAA server applied to it. So you'll see I have an authentication profile applied to that there. So let me edit this. So that's going to be my AAA stuff there. But if I go to my AAA virtual server here, this is really what I wanted to show. So I mentioned before in that kind of mixed match of a diagram earlier, I have a logon schema as well as a policy, and I have a certificate assigned to my AAA V server. So you'll see I have a logon schema here, the ls poll user pass, so that's what displays again the user, the username and password field to the end user. And sorry, go back to it really quick. I think I could explain a couple more things here. And you'll see it has a profile assigned to it, and this profile is what's going to actually have that XML information regarding the form there. Let's go into the policy. So I also have a policy here, and that's the username pass policy, and you'll see it has an action of auth AD, so that's going to be my LDAP authentication action, which has information about my LDAP server. But you'll see here I have a go-to expression called next, and that's going to go to my policy label called check groups, which will check that group membership again. So to show you what that looks like, let's expand policies as well as authentication and advanced policies. So you have both advanced and basic policies here. Policy labels are going to fall under advanced, and you'll see I have my check groups policy label here. And I mentioned in the slide deck that I don't have a logon schema associated with this. That's because I don't want to present anything to the user yet. I just want to check the group membership of that user that just authenticated. And once that's extracted, you'll see I have a policy here where it's getting the extraction and it's checking if the user is a member of the Citrix OneFA group. If the user is a member of the Citrix OneFA group, then we'll end the expression. They're logged in, they're authenticated. However, if they're not, it's going to go to the next priority, because lower priority always takes precedence, and it's going to this radius non-manager policy label. So if we go to a radius non-manager, actually it might just be a regular policy here. You'll see it says no auth here. Let me double check that. Here we go. It's going to radius non-manager 2. So this is a policy label. Okay, that's what I thought. And this policy label has a policy associated to it called radius ADV, which has an action called radius. And if I was to go to policies here, you'll see I have radius ADV. I have an action which has information about my radius server here. So that's kind of how everything works together. Just to show you the logon schema here as well. So I'll show you the radius one. You can see how that works. So you see how I have an XML file here. It's extremely easy to edit this. You just have to SSH into your NetScaler and open this up in like Notepad++ or Notepad, and it's very easy to make changes to this. There's some pre-configured ones that you can use as a basis. There's a few things you can edit right off the bat, like some text, without having to go into the XML. But this is what it looks like, and this is what the user is going to be presented with. So if I was to go back here again, just to show another example, let's say I wanted to log in again with my Orion account. You'll see the first thing I'm seeing is a logon schema for my username and password, and it's going to authenticate using that policy, and it's going to check my group membership with that policy label, and it's going to see I'm not a part of the Citrix OneFA group, so it's going to pass that first priority one and go to the second, and it's going to ask me for my second authentication factor, which again is it's going to go to that radius add policy, and when I present my radius, my OTP as my secondary factor, it's going to authenticate me into my ADC. So that's really everything I wanted to show today. I know it was kind of kind of quick. And if you're like me and you had no experience with AAA, it's probably a lot. So I wasn't the smart guy to figure out how to configure this all, so I'll provide a link to how I figured out how to configure this in my environment. And if you do have any questions, feel free to comment below and I'll do my best to answer those. Also, if you have any feedback or videos you would like to see in the future, I love to hear that kind of stuff, so feel free to write below and just let me know. Thanks, everyone.